Today we are going to talk about Macmillan 6 Story Chapter 4 Time Twist. Let's start with reading our text, Chapter 4 in our story. Find Albert. That evening, after work, Robert and Lucy hurried over to the schoolroom. They didn't want to be late and make Mrs. Bleak angry again. Lucy and Robert quickly sat in their places, but George's place next to Robert's was empty. Robert wondered where he was. He looked over to Albert's place. That was empty too. How strange, he thought. Mrs. Bleak tapped on the table with a long ruler. Pay attention, she shouted. Everyone sat up straight and looked at Mrs. Bleak. We will start with the multiplication tables. Begin. 1's 2 is 2. 2 2's are 4. 3 2's are 6. The children chanted. 1's 2 is 2 means 1 times 2 is 2. 2 times 2 are 4. 3 times 2 are 6. Mrs. Bleak walked up and down the rows of desks. She carried the ruler in her hand and swished it through the air as she walked. Robert and Lucy wondered why the children looked so scared. They soon found out. If a child didn't know their multiplication tables or said them too slowly, she hit them across the hands with the ruler. Slap. That will teach you. She snapped at a little girl who spoke too slowly. What a horrible woman, thought Lucy. I'm so glad my teacher isn't like her. Suddenly, the door flew open and George ran in. Mrs. Bleak glared at him. She pointed at the clock on the wall with the ruler. What time do you call this? She shouted. I'm sorry, Mrs. Bleak, but I can't find Albert. He's missing, cried George. Missing? Snapped Mrs. Bleak. I expect he has run away. She turned to the rest of the class, and we all know what happens to children who run away, don't we? Yes, Mrs. Bleak, replied the children. Mrs. Bleak pointed to a boy in the back row. His name is Jacob. Jacob, remind George what happens to children who run away. She bellowed. Jacob stood up looking miserable. They are punished, Mrs. Bleak, he muttered. I don't think he has run away, Mrs. Bleak. I just can't find him, cried George. He was very upset. Then go and look for him, she answered. Robert and Lucy helped George look for Albert. And when you do find him, he will be punished. Robert, Lucy, and George ran out of the schoolroom. We must find him quickly, said George. He will be in even more trouble if we don't. Where do you think he is? Asked Lucy. Let's search down by the stream. He may have gone there to play, suggested Robert. The children walked down to the stream. Lucy shivered. It looked very black and dangerous. She took out a small torch from her pocket and switched it on. What's that? Asked George. It's my torch, replied Lucy. George looked at it with admiration. He had never seen a torch before. Here, Lucy is taking out the torch from her pocket, and George looks very amazed. He never saw a torch before. Quickly George's thoughts returned to Albert. Where can he be? Wondered George. He was very worried. Perhaps he has run away. Just then Lucy had an idea. Albert looked very pale after his accident, she said. Perhaps he has hidden somewhere to rest. But where? Asked Robert. Lucy thought for a moment. It's a cold night, so he may have found a warm place to sleep in the factory. She replied, Let's look in the factory. Then said Robert. The children ran back to the factory. It wasn't locked, so they went inside. Robert and George searched one end of the factory while Lucy searched the other. Sure enough, she found Albert lying fast asleep under a spinning machine. He's over here, she called. Robert and George ran over. Albert, we have been so worried about you, cried George. He shook his brother. Come on, wake up. Albert slowly opened his eyes and yawned. What's the matter? He asked. Why are you cross with me, George? We have been searching everywhere for you, he replied. We thought you had run away. Albert sat up and rubbed his eyes. He touched the cut on his head. It was very sore and his head hurt too. I wish I could run away, he sighed. I hate this place and my head still hurts. Lucy helped Albert stand up. I'll go first, whispered Robert. You two follow me. One by one, the children crawled through the window and into the office. In the darkness, they could just make out Mr. Bleak's desk. Here the children are going to look for the book address in Mr. Bleak's desk. A large cat was asleep on the top. The children crept over to the desk. Carefully, Lucy opened the drawers one at a time. She found the books and the papers, but no address book. There is only one drawer left, she whispered. I hope it's in here. She pulled the drawer open. It squeaked loudly. Shh, whispered Robert. Lucy held her breath and waited. Nothing happened, so she opened the drawer wider and looked inside. There was a red address book with addresses written on it in gold lettering. Here the children found the address book and they are looking for the address of Mr. Featherstone to send him a letter to tell him about what Mr. Bleak and Mrs. Bleak made with the children and how they treated the children badly. Here in this picture, Lucy is looking for the address book in the drawers. The cat is sitting on the desk, and George and Robert are waiting until Lucy found the address book. Before anyone was awake the next morning, Lucy got up and wrote a letter to Mr. Featherstone. She wrote a letter to Mr. Featherstone to visit the factory school and to know him how Mr. Bleak and Mrs. Bleak treated the children badly and cruelly. She ran out of the factory and all the way to his house. She is going to the house of Mr. Featherstone. She knocked on the door. A maid opened it. Lucy wanted the maid to send the letter to Mr. Featherstone or to give it to Mr. Featherstone. Please, will you give this letter to Mr. Featherstone? Asked Lucy. Yes, of course, she promised. The maid promised Lucy to give the letter to Mr. Featherstone when he came back. Yes, of course, she promised. Thank you, cried Lucy, and ran back to the factory. She arrived just as the other apprentices were getting up. You are awake early, said Emmy. I couldn't sleep, replied Lucy, and smiled to herself. Here, Lucy, when she says I couldn't sleep, she's not sleeping. She's going to, or she went to, the house of Mr. Featherstone to give him the letter, and she came back to the factory school. I couldn't sleep, replied Lucy, and smiled to herself. All they had to do now was wait for Mr. Featherstone to visit. So all the children, Lucy, Robert, Albert, and George, they are waiting for the visit of Mr. Featherstone to tell him about how Mr. Bleak and Mrs. Bleak treated the children badly and cruelly. Now we have finished reading chapter 4 in our story Time Twist. Goodbye. See you next time.